Here's what you need to understand about March 6, 1944. The Luftwaffe wasn't stupid. They'd done the math. Fuel capacity divided by consumption rate equals maximum range. And that maximum range, for every Allied single-engine fighter, stopped well short of Berlin. The P-47 Thunderbolt could reach Aachen. The P-38 Lightning might stretch to Hanover. But Berlin itself, 500 miles deep into the Reich? Mathematically impossible, except Major Hans Kogler climbing through 28,000 feet in his Bf-109 that crystalline morning, was about to discover that the Americans had found a loophole in the laws of physics, not by breaking them, by applying them more creatively than anyone in the German High Command had imagined possible. The thin air bit at Kogler's lungs as he scanned the winter sky. Below, Brandenburg's frozen landscape stretched toward Berlin's suburbs. Above, contrails marked another American bomber stream, fat, lazy, and according to ground control, completely vulnerable. His formation of 41 Bf-109s climbed steadily. The P-47 escorts had already turned back at the Ruhr. They always did, like clockwork, like physics demanded. Kogler adjusted his oxygen mask and keyed his radio. All aircraft, maintain climb. We hit them at Angels 28, diving attack from the sun. Standard. Achtung! Fighters at 12 o'clock high, single engine, American markings. Kogler's hand froze on the throttle. His wingman's voice carried an edge of panic that veteran pilots didn't show. Repeat that, Kogler said flatly. Single-engine fighters, Herr Major, with drop tanks, they're impossible. The word came automatically, reflexively. Because it was impossible, the fuel mathematics were unbreakable. The American P-47 could barely scratch German airspace. Even the twin-engine P-38 couldn't reach this far and fight, this deep, over Brandenburg, 50 kilometers from Berlin itself. The laws of physics didn't negotiate. Before we continue, click that subscribe button, like this video, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It brings me great joy, knowing that these war stories and lessons get to people all over the world. Your support helps us bring more thrilling war stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now, let's get back to the story. Kogler squinted through his canopy into the high sun, searching for his wingman's phantom fighters. Probably Bf-100Bs from another grouper, misidentified in the glare. Or maybe... Then he saw them. Silver shapes sliding out of the sun's corona like knives from a sheath. Long-nosed, sleek, unmistakable squared-off tail surfaces catching the light. P-51 Mustangs. And they weren't alone. Dozens of them. Maybe more. Cruising in loose formations above and ahead of the bomber stream, moving with the casual confidence of predators who owned the sky. Kogler's breath caught. Because these fighters weren't struggling at the edge of their range, engines coughing, desperate to turn for home. They weren't low on fuel, hugging the bombers in a last-ditch escort. They were above his formation, stalking, waiting. As Kogler watched, frozen in disbelief, the nearest Mustang rolled inverted. Its pilot twisted in the cockpit, looking down, looking directly at Kogler's Bf-109. And Kogler saw the moment of recognition. The American saw him. Marked him. Then came the objects tumbling from the Mustang's wings, paper drop tanks, sunlight flashing off their aluminum bands as they fell away and tumbled toward Earth like discarded beer cans. Not one, not two. Dozens across the formation, all jettisoning external fuel simultaneously, which meant... Kogler's mind stuttered over the implication. Which meant they'd flown here on external fuel. Which meant their internal tanks were still full. Which meant they had fuel to burn. Fuel for combat. Fuel for the flight home. Fuel that shouldn't exist. The lead Mustang completed its roll and dove, tracers already stitching the air. Kogler's radio exploded with panic. "Brake right! Brake!" In that frozen instant before his training took over and his hand slammed the stick sideways, Major Hans Kogler understood with perfect, terrible clarity that everything he'd been taught about this war, every briefing, every range table, every assurance from the Air Ministry, was a lie. Not a mistake. A lie. And the proof was diving toward him at 400 miles per hour, guns blazing. But to understand how completely this moment shattered German confidence, you first need to understand where that confidence came from. The Luftwaffe's defensive strategy wasn't built on hope or wishful thinking. It was built on mathematics. Cold, precise, unforgiving arithmetic that every fighter pilot learned in training. Fuel capacity minus reserve equals combat radius. You couldn't negotiate with it. You couldn't will your way past it. Physics didn't care about courage or determination. And the physics were clear. Germany was safe. The doctrine was elegant in its simplicity. German fighters, the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Focke-Wulf FW 190, were designed as short-range interceptors. They didn't need long legs. They operated under a defensive fighter umbrella that covered the Reich, rising from airfields scattered across Germany to meet threats as they penetrated deeper into the homeland. The deeper the enemy bombers flew, the thinner their escort became. Every mile east was a mile closer to sanctuary. The Reich Air Ministry's official range tables, updated quarterly and distributed to every fighter grouper, spelled it out with clinical precision. Allied fighter maximum combat radii as of January 1944. Supermarine Spitfire, 175 miles, barely crosses the Channel. Republic P-47, Thunderbolt, 230 miles, Aachen and western edge of Germany. Lockheed P-38, Lightning, 340 miles, Hanover on perfect conditions. Hypothetical single-engine escort to Berlin, impossible, 520 plus miles required. The math was ironclad. Berlin sat 500 miles from England. Any single-engine fighter attempting that journey would need roughly 200 miles of total range, 500 out, 200 for combat maneuvering and contingency, 500 back. No existing Allied single-engine fighter carried that much fuel. None. Oberst Werner Mülders, the Luftwaffe's legendary tactician, had written in a 1941 training directive, "The laws of fuel consumption guarantee that central Germany remains beyond single-engine escort range. Plan your defensive deployments accordingly. This is not theory. It is physics." General der Jagdflieger Adolf Galland reinforced this certainty in every briefing. The American daylight bombing campaign, he explained, was strategically flawed at its foundation. Unescorted bombers deep over Germany were target practice. The Americans would either accept unsustainable losses or abandon their doctrine entirely. It wasn't arrogance, it was certainty. And God help any pilot who questioned it. In January 1944, Lieutenant Klaus Mitusch of JG-26 filed a combat report claiming he'd engaged long-range American single-engine fighters near Osnabrück, 200 miles inside Germany. His squadron commander called him into the office. "You're mistaken," the commander said, sliding the official range table across the desk. "See? Maximum P-47 radius, 230 miles. You were at 200. They were at their absolute limit, probably nursing failing engines. What you saw was desperation, not capability. Herr Hauptmann, they were climbing when I—" "You're tired, Mitusch. Take 3 days leave." The report was amended. Engaged P-47s at extreme range, aircraft showing signs of fuel exhaustion. 2 weeks later, Hauptmann Heinrich Erler reported single-engine fighters near Brunswick, 150 miles deeper than the tables allowed. This time, the response wasn't gentle. Ehrler was summoned to division headquarters and subjected to what his wingman later described as a lecture on basic mathematics from a staff officer who'd never flown combat. The implication was clear. Question the range tables, and you questioned your own competence. Or worse, your loyalty. By February 1944, fighter pilots had learned to keep their mouths shut. If you saw something that contradicted the official numbers, you either misidentified the aircraft or kept it to yourself. The Reich Air Ministry issued a directive on February 15th that made the policy explicit. Reports of American single-engine fighters operating beyond established maximum range are to be treated as misidentifications. Pilots persisting in such claims will undergo medical evaluation for combat fatigue. The message was unmistakable. The math was settled. Physics was settled. Reality was settled. Germany was safe behind an arithmetic shield that the Allies could not penetrate. General Major Joseph Schmid, commanding our Jagdkorps, summarized the strategic situation in a February 1944 staff meeting with complete confidence. Gentlemen, the Americans face an unsolvable problem. They can bomb the Ruhr with heavy escort. They can bomb Berlin without escort and suffer catastrophic losses. But they cannot do both. The distance is too great. The fuel capacity does not exist. This is not a matter of engineering or willpower. It is mathematics, and mathematics does not negotiate. 3 weeks later, P-51 Mustangs would appear over Berlin, and the mathematics would reveal themselves to be nothing more than assumptions wrapped in false precision. Confidence built on ignorance of what American industry was quietly making possible. But first, the Americans had to solve a problem that was killing them by the hundreds. The Germans were right about one thing. Unescorted bombers over Germany were dying. Not slowly, not occasionally, systematically. October 14th, 1943, Schweinfurt, Germany. The 8th Air Force dispatched 291 B-17 Flying Fortresses to destroy the ball-bearing factories that supplied 40% of Germany's war production. The target was vital. The intelligence was solid. The plan was meticulous. The range tables said American fighters could escort the bombers to the German border, maybe slightly beyond. Then the bombers would be on their own for 200 miles, deep over Germany. Alone. The Luftwaffe was waiting. Of those 291 fortresses, 60 never came home. Another 138 limped back to England, so badly damaged they were temporarily non-operational. Shredded by 20mm cannon fire, hydraulics bleeding, dead gunners still in their turrets. Loss rate, 20.6%. Casualties, 650 airmen, killed, wounded, or missing in a single day. 8th Air Force planners did the math immediately. At those loss rates, bomber groups would be completely destroyed within weeks. Crews were already flying their 3rd, 4th, 5th missions over Germany, watching friends' aircraft explode or spiral down trailing fire. The psychological toll was measurable. Mission briefings ended with crews vomiting in trash cans. Letters home became shorter, emptier. Some men simply stopped writing. After Schweinfurt, General Ira Eaker, commanding the 8th Air Force, was forced to make a devastating admission to his superiors in Washington. Deep penetration raids without fighter escort are unsustainable. We either develop a long-range escort fighter, or we abandon daylight precision bombing entirely. The British nodded knowingly. They'd learned this lesson in 1940 and switched to night bombing. Less accurate, less effective, but survivable. The Americans weren't ready to admit defeat, but they also weren't ready to keep bleeding. The numbers told a grim story. USAAF heavy bomber loss rates, 1943. Missions with full fighter escort to target, 2 to 3% losses. Missions with partial escort, turned back mid-route, 7–9% losses. Missions beyond fighter range, unescorted, 12–20% losses. You didn't need an advanced degree to see the pattern. Where American fighters could reach, bombers survived. Where fighters couldn't reach, bombers died. The problem was simple. American fighters couldn't reach far enough. The P-47 Thunderbolt was a beast. Tough, heavily armed, capable in a dogfight. But its radial engine guzzled fuel. Maximum escort range, 230 miles. Barely into Germany. The P-38 Lightning had better range thanks to its twin engines. But it was temperamental at high altitude, expensive to produce, and maxed out around 340 miles. Hanover on a good day. Berlin remained 160 miles beyond its grasp. The British Spitfire, magnificent in a dogfight, was practically useless as an escort. Range, 175 miles. It could barely cross the Channel and fight. Washington was desperate. Aviation engineers were given a single directive: find us a fighter that can go to Berlin and back, or we stop the daylight bombing campaign. The irony is that the solution already existed. It just didn't know what it was for yet. The North American P-51 Mustang had been designed in 1940 as a low-altitude tactical fighter for the British. It was fast, maneuverable, and cheap to produce. But its Allison engine wheezed above 15,000 feet, making it useless for escorting high-altitude bombers. The RAF used them for ground attack and photo reconnaissance. The USAF mostly ignored them. Then, in late 1942, someone at Rolls-Royce had an idea. What if you took the P-51's brilliant airframe, that sleek, low-drag, laminar flow wing design, and replaced the mediocre Allison engine with a Packard-built Merlin? The Merlin was a high-altitude engine, proven in Spitfires. It had a 2-stage supercharger that thrived in thin air, and Packard was already manufacturing them by the thousands in Detroit for British aircraft. The test results were stunning. The P-51B, Mustang with Merlin, could cruise at 440 millimeters at 30,000 feet. It handled beautifully. And most importantly, its clean aerodynamic design sipped fuel instead of guzzling it. Internal fuel capacity, 269 gallons. Range with that fuel, approximately 600 miles, still not enough for Berlin. But then British engineers added one more innovation: expendable drop tanks. 2 108-gallon paper tanks under the wings. Cheap, light, disposable. Suddenly, the math changed. Total fuel capacity, 485 gallons. Maximum range, 1,300 plus miles. Combat radius, with reserves, 650 plus miles. Berlin was 500 miles from England. For the first time, the arithmetic worked. In December 1943, the first P-51Bs arrived in England. Pilots transitioned from P-47s and were stunned by the difference. Lighter, faster, smoother. And those drop tanks? Lieutenant Colonel Don Blakesley, commanding the 4th Fighter Group, said it best. Boys, we just got handed the keys to the whole damn Reich. We can go anywhere they can go, and we can stay there long enough to kill them. The Luftwaffe's calculations were about to meet American engineering, and the sky over Berlin was about to change hands. Here's what the Germans missed. The Americans didn't invent a miracle fighter. They combined 3 unremarkable solutions into something the Luftwaffe's technical experts had declared physically impossible. Individually, none of it was revolutionary. Together, it rewrote the rules of air combat. First, the engine. The Packard Phi 1653. Merlin wasn't some exotic prototype built by genius engineers in a secret laboratory. It was a licensed copy of a British engine, manufactured in a Detroit automotive plant, using techniques Packard had perfected, making luxury car engines. Rolls-Royce designed the Merlin. Packard made it better. British Merlins were hand-assembled by skilled craftsmen, each engine slightly different, tolerances varying. Packard applied American mass production philosophy: interchangeable parts, precision machining, assembly line efficiency. The result: an engine built to tolerances that exceeded the original British specifications. Every component machined to jeweler's precision, every Merlin identical to the next. And Packard was building them at a rate that stunned even American planners. One engine every 20 minutes at peak production. But the real innovation wasn't the manufacturing. It was the two-stage, two-speed supercharger. Most fighter engines in 1943 used single-stage superchargers. They compressed incoming air once before feeding it to the engine. Fine at low altitude, terrible above 20,000 feet, where air pressure dropped and engines gasped for oxygen. The Merlin's two-stage system compressed the air twice. First stage feeding the second stage feeding the engine. The result was an engine that didn't just survive at high altitude. It thrived there. At sea level, 1,490 horsepower. At 30,000 feet, still over 200 horsepower. German Daimler-Benz engines lost 40% of their power above 25,000 feet. The Merlin lost barely 20%. When bolted into the P-51's sleek airframe, the Packard Merlin transformed a good fighter into something exceptional. But it still wasn't enough for Berlin. Not without the second piece of the puzzle. Sander, the drop tanks. The British had been experimenting with auxiliary fuel tanks since 1940. Early versions were metal, sturdy, reusable, and heavy. A P-51 carrying two 108-gallon metal tanks, handled like a truck. Acceleration suffered, maneuverability tanked. German fighters could kill you before you jettisoned them. Then engineers at the Royal Aircraft Establishment tried something radical. Build them out of paper, not cardboard, not flimsy newsprint. Laminated craft paper, impregnated with plastic resin. The same material used for making moisture-resistant packaging. The specifications were almost comical in their simplicity. Weight, empty. 35 pounds. Lighter than the ammunition for a single .50 cal machine gun. Fuel capacity, 108 gallons. Structural lifespan, approximately 5 hours before resin breakdown. Cost to manufacture, roughly $15 per tank. Compare that to German auxiliary tanks. Weight, empty, 95 pounds. Fuel capacity, 66 gallons. Cost, 200 plus. Per tank, reusable, theoretically. The German tanks were engineered like precision instruments. The Allied tanks were engineered like Kleenex, cheap, disposable, good enough for one use. And that difference was everything. A P-51B with two paper drop tanks could 1. Take off carrying 485 gallons of fuel total, 269 internal, plus 216 external. 2. Cruise to Berlin on the external tanks, burning them dry. 3. Jettison the tanks in under 3 seconds when entering combat. Fight with full performance, as if the tanks had never existed. 5. Still have 269 gallons of internal fuel for combat, and the flight home. The math was beautiful. Fuel to Berlin on 150 gallons burned from drop tanks. Fuel for 30 minutes of combat. 50 gallons internal. Fuel for return flight. 140 gallons internal. Reserve margin. Done 30 gallons. For the first time, an American fighter could reach Berlin, fight, and come home. Third, the philosophy. German engineers had approached the escort problem with Teutonic precision. Build a fighter with enough internal fuel to reach the target. The result? Heavy, sluggish designs that couldn't dogfight effectively. American engineers approached it differently. What if we just carry extra fuel we can throw away? It wasn't elegant, it wasn't sophisticated, but it worked. Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Zemke explained the tactical revolution. The Germans expected us to husband every gallon, to fly on the edge of our range. But with drop tanks, we could burn fuel like millionaires on the cruise out. We'd hit Berlin with full internal tanks. fresh, ready to fight. Meanwhile, the Germans had been climbing and maneuvering for 20 minutes, burning fuel just to intercept us. We had the advantage before the first shot was fired. So here's what the Luftwaffe faced without knowing it. An engine that produced 1,200 horsepower at 30,000 feet, manufactured to precision tolerances in a Detroit plant, churning out 3 per hour. Drop tanks that weighed nothing, cost nothing, and extended range by 400 miles, then vanished the instant combat began. And an airframe designed with such aerodynamic efficiency that it could escort bombers 500 miles, fight for half an hour, and fly home with fuel to spare. None of it was revolutionary. All of it was impossible, according to German calculations, and it was already over England, waiting to prove those calculations wrong. The reports started small, scattered, easily dismissed, but they kept coming. January 11th, 1944, Brunswick, Germany, 150 miles inside the Reich. Major Hermann Graf, commanding JG 11, was climbing through 22,000 feet when his wingman called out American fighters diving from above. Graf's first thought, P-47s, at extreme range, desperate to hit and run. But these fighters didn't hit and run. They stayed, circled, engaged for nearly 8 minutes before disengaging, climbing away, not diving for the deck like aircraft running on fumes. Graf's after-action report was careful, measured. Encountered single-engine American fighters, type uncertain, approximately 150 miles east of the Rhine. Aircraft demonstrated unusual endurance and climb performance. Recommend intelligence evaluation of possible range extension modifications. 3 days later, Graf was summoned to division headquarters. A staff colonel, who'd never flown combat, spread range tables across the desk. Major Graf, the P-47 Thunderbolt has a maximum combat radius of 230 miles. You engaged at Brunswick, which is 150 miles inside Germany, roughly 280 miles from England. These fighters were at their absolute limit. What you interpreted as unusual endurance was merely the final minutes of their fuel supply. Herr Oberst, they were climbing when they broke off. Adrenaline affects perception, Major. Combat is stressful. The mind sees what it expects. The report was filed with an annotation. Extreme range P-47 encounter. Aircraft likely nursing engine problems. No intelligence value. Graf returned to his squadron and said nothing. January 29th, 1944. Hanover, 200+ miles inside Germany. Hauptmann Heinrich Erler of JG5 had better eyes than most pilots. When he spotted the American fighters positioning above a bomber formation near Hanover, he knew immediately they weren't P-47s. Wrong silhouette, different exhaust pattern, and they were too far east, nearly 100 miles beyond where Thunderbolts should be able to reach and fight. His combat report was explicit. Engaged unknown American single-engine fighters at approximately 210 miles penetration. Aircraft type unidentified, but not P-47 Thunderbolt. Recommend urgent intelligence assessment. The response came within 48 hours. Erler was ordered to Division HQ for what his wingman later described as a mathematics lesson from officers who'd never pulled G's. The lecture lasted an hour. Fuel consumption rates, engine efficiency curves, maximum theoretical range calculations. The conclusion was presented as scientific fact. No Allied single-engine fighter can operate at 200+ miles penetration and retain combat fuel. Your identification was mistaken. The aircraft were either P-47s at extreme range or twin-engine P-38s, misidentified due to angle and distance. Erler pushed back. Herr General Major, I've fought P-38s. These were single-engine. Are you questioning the Reich Air Ministry's technical intelligence, Hauptmann? The question hung in the air like a threat. Erler shut his mouth. His report was amended by staff officers. Engaged P-38 Lightning fighters near Hanover, February 3, 1944. Magdeburg, 250 miles inside Germany. By early February, reports were arriving weekly. Osnabrück, Göttingen, Kassel, Magdeburg. Every location pushed the reported range of American fighters further east. Every report was met with the same response: misidentification, combat stress, or impossible. Junior officers learned quickly. Reporting long-range American fighters was career suicide. Better to write P-38 in your report and keep your mouth shut than face accusations of incompetence, or worse, defeatism. February 15, 1944, the directive. The Reich Air Ministry made the policy official. Directive: Fighter Aircraft Identification. Reports of American single-engine fighters operating beyond 280 miles penetration, maximum P-47 combat radius, are to be treated as misidentifications. Aircraft in question are either A. Twin-engine P-38 Lightning fighters, B. Friendly aircraft misidentified under combat conditions, C. P-47 Thunderbolts at absolute maximum range. Pilots persisting in reports contradicting established maximum range data will undergo medical evaluation for combat fatigue. Squadron commanders failing to correct such reports will be held accountable for maintaining unit discipline and morale. The message was clear. Reality could not contradict the range tables. If it appeared to, reality was wrong. Hauptmann Heinz Knoke, commanding the Sergun to JG-11, wrote in his diary on February 18th, "We've been ordered to stop reporting the long-range fighters. Staff says they don't exist, that we're seeing P-38s or imagining things, but I've flown against P-38s since 1943. I know what they look like, how they move. These new fighters are different, faster, more agile, and they're showing up where nothing should be able to reach. The pilots know the truth. Command refuses to see it. I wonder which is more dangerous, the American fighters or our own leadership's blindness." By late February 1944, a strange cognitive dissonance had settled over Luftwaffe fighter units. Frontline pilots knew American fighters were penetrating deeper than the tables allowed. Staff officers knew such penetration was mathematically impossible. High command knew the frontline reports must therefore be mistaken. Everyone was trapped in their own version of reality, unable to reconcile the contradiction. And then came March 6, 1944. The day the contradiction appeared over Berlin, in formations too large to dismiss, too visible to deny, and too lethal to ignore. The day the whispers became screams. March 6, 1944, 11:47 hours, 30,000 feet above Brandenburg. The sky belonged to Germany, or so Oberst Hannes Trautloft believed, as he watched the plots develop on the operations board at Döberitz Fighter Control. 7:30. American heavy bombers approaching from the northwest, the largest formation yet directed at Berlin. But the fighter escort plot told the familiar story. P-47s turning back near the Ruhr, P-38s disengaging near Hanover. By the time the bombers reached Brandenburg, they'd be alone, vulnerable. Trautloft gave the order. All units, scramble. Vector to intercept over Potsdam. Expect unescorted bombers at Angels 25. Across a dozen airfields surrounding Berlin, fighter engines roared to life. 12-20 hours, climbing through 24,000 feet, Major Hans Kogler led his mixed formation upward. 7 Bf-110 heavy fighters, 41 Bf-109s. The familiar pre-combat tension settled over the pilots. Not fear, anticipation. Unescorted American bombers were a gift. "All aircraft, maintain climb to Angels 28, Kogler transmitted. We'll hit them from above and behind. Standard bomber attack. Watch for..." His wingman's voice cut through, tight with confusion. "Greenhouse lead. This is 3. I have single-engine fighters. High. 12 o'clock. Kogler's jaw tightened. Say again, 3. Single-engine fighters, Herr Major. American markings. Above the bombers. Impossible. The P-47s had turned back 40 minutes ago. The plots confirmed it. Kogler squinted into the high sun, searching. Then he saw them, silver glints catching light at 32,000 feet. Dozens of them, positioned perfectly above and ahead of the bomber stream like wolves stalking a herd. His radio discipline collapsed. What the hell are those? 12:22 hours. Recognition. Lieutenant Jan Müller, flying wing in the Bf-109 formation, got close enough to identify the silhouette. Long nose, squared wingtips, bubble canopy, P-51 Mustangs. But that was impossible. Mustangs were ground attack aircraft, low-altitude fighters. They didn't escort bombers. They couldn't reach. Then he saw the objects separating from the American fighters' wings. Drop tanks, dozens of them across the formation, tumbling away in the thin air, sunlight flashing off metal bands. They flew here on external fuel, which meant their internal tanks were full, which meant they had fuel for combat, fuel to fight, fuel to... Brake right, brake. The warning came too late. 1223 hours. The Dive Major Thomas Hayes, Jr., leading the 357th Fighter Group's 33 Mustangs, had been watching the German fighters climb for 3 minutes. Perfect position, perfect surprise, perfect setup. Greenhouse Squadron, drop tanks, attack. 33 Mustangs jettisoned fuel tanks simultaneously and rolled into near-vertical dives, building speed, picking targets. The German formation never saw them coming. Hayes locked onto a Bf-109 climbing ahead, still focused on the bombers. The German pilot never looked up, never jinked, never knew. Hayes opened fire at 400 yards. Tracers walked up the fuselage. The 109's canopy shattered. The aircraft snap-rolled right and fell away, trailing smoke. Around him, the sky exploded into chaos. 1224 hours. Slaughter Feldwebel Müller watched his formation disintegrate. 3 Bf-109s gone in the first pass. Just gone, tumbling earthward in flames. The Bf-110 heavy fighters, slow and cumbersome, were butchered. One exploded so violently, the shockwave rattled Müller's canopy from 200 meters away. The radios screamed, "They're above us. I can't shake him. I can't. Parachute at 3 o'clock. Who's... Mein Gott, they're everywhere." Müller hauled his 109 into a desperate climbing turn, lungs straining against G-forces. An American fighter, sleek, silver, impossibly fast, flashed past his nose, already tracking another target. These weren't the lumbering P-47s that fought like heavyweight boxers. These were dancers, agile, fast, relentless, and they had fuel to stay. Kogler's voice, hoarse with disbelief. "All aircraft, disengage, dive for the deck, get out of here." But disengaging required speed, altitude, space to run. The Mustangs gave them none of it. 1235 hours, aftermath 12 minutes. That's how long the engagement lasted. Hayes reformed his squadron at 28,000 feet and counted noses. 33 Mustangs in, 33 Mustangs still flying. Below, black smoke trails marked where German fighters had gone down. 7 confirmed. Maybe more. The bomber stream continued toward Berlin, untouched. Hayes checked his fuel gauge. 180 gallons remaining. Plenty for the fight home. He keyed his radio. "Greenhouse Squadron, good shooting. Resume escort position. We've got another 2 hours over Germany." 2 more hours. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Not for the Americans, but for every German pilot listening on the frequency. 1240 hours. Döberitz fighter control. Oberst Trautloft stared at the plots in disbelief. His entire intercept force scattered, retreating, combat losses streaming in. And the American fighters were still there, still circling over Brandenburg, still escorting, still here, 500 miles from England, with fuel to burn. He reached for the phone to call Berlin, to call Galland, to report what his eyes refused to believe. The Americans had broken the mathematics, and the sky over the Reich belonged to them now. March 6th, 1944, 14:30 hours, Karin-Hall Estate, 50 miles north of Berlin. Reichsmarschall. Hermann Göring was finishing lunch when the call came through. General Major Adolf Galland's voice was tight, controlled. Herr Reichsmarschall, American fighters are over Berlin, single-engine fighters, P-51 Mustangs. Göring's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. You're mistaken, Galland. I have visual confirmation from multiple sources. They're engaging our fighters over Potsdam at this moment. Impossible. The word came automatically. Check your reports again. The pilots are seeing P-38s. Or they're... Herr Reichsmarschall, I am looking at the contrails from my office window. Single-engine fighters. Over Berlin. The phone cracked against the wall. According to Oberst Bernd von Brauchitsch, Göring's aide who witnessed the scene, the Reichsmarschall's rage was volcanic. This is treason, sabotage. The pilots are lying, covering their cowardice. I will have every man who makes such claims court-martialed. But even as Göring screamed, the evidence was undeniable. From the estate's windows, he could see the contrails stitching across the sky over Berlin. Hear the distant thunder of engines at combat power. Von Brauchitsch would later testify that Göring stood at the window for nearly an hour, watching, saying nothing. March 8th, 1944. Reich Air Ministry, Berlin Galland, arrived at the emergency conference carrying physical evidence. He placed a crumpled piece of metal on the table, a P-51 drop tank fragment, clearly stamped Made in USA, recovered from a field near Magdeburg. Herr Reichsmarschall, this is from an American auxiliary fuel tank. Paper construction, 108-gallon capacity. They're jettisoning them before combat. It explains everything. Göring's fist slammed the table. I don't care if you bring me a whole Mustang on a silver platter. The Americans cannot escort to Berlin. It's scientifically impossible. Our engineers confirmed it. The fuel mathematics don't allow. The mathematics were wrong, Galland said quietly. The room went silent. Göring's face turned crimson. You dare. The mathematics assumed fixed internal fuel capacity. The Americans simply carried more fuel and threw it away when they didn't need it. We didn't account for that because we never imagined building disposable tanks cheap enough to throw away by the 100. Galland slid technical analysis across the table. Calculations from Luftwaffe engineers who'd examined crashed Mustangs, range estimates, fuel consumption data. Göring didn't look at it. This meeting is over. Any pilot reporting American single-engine fighters over Berlin will be arrested for spreading defeatist propaganda. That is my final word. March 9th, 1944. Galland's office. Galland sat alone, staring at the physical evidence Göring had refused to examine. In his post-war memoir, he would write, "That was the moment I knew Germany had lost the war. Not because American fighters could reach Berlin. Engineering problems have engineering solutions. But because our leadership would rather court-martial reality than adapt to it. When ideology replaces analysis, defeat becomes inevitable." Outside his window, contrails marked another American bomber stream approaching the capital. Escorted all the way, P-51s didn't just win dogfights. They strangled the system that produced German pilots. March-April 1944, targeting the fuel. The 8th Air Force had a new strategy, enabled by a simple fact. Mustangs could now escort bombers anywhere in Germany. including the synthetic fuel plants. Germany had no oil fields. Every drop of aviation fuel came from coal liquefaction plants, massive industrial complexes that turned coal into gasoline through chemistry and pressure. Brilliant engineering. Strategically vulnerable and now completely exposed. Luna, Pulitz, Brucks, Blechhammer. The P-51s escorted bombers to each one. The plants were bombed methodically, repeatedly. By May 1944, German aviation fuel production had collapsed by 60%. By September, 90%. The Luftwaffe didn't just lose fuel for combat missions, it lost fuel for training. The training collapse. In 1942, Luftwaffe fighter pilots received 240 hours of flight training before their first combat mission. They learned dogfighting, gunnery, formation tactics, emergency procedures. They arrived at frontline squadrons as competent aviators. By mid-1944, training hours had collapsed to 40-60 hours total. Some pilots reached operational units with barely 20 hours in their assigned aircraft. The reason was simple. There wasn't enough fuel to train them properly. Hauptmann Heinz Knoke, now commanding JG-11, wrote in June 1944. The replacements arrive barely able to fly straight and level. No gunnery training, no combat tactics, no experience with oxygen systems at altitude. We send them up against American pilots with 300+ combat hours, flying superior aircraft, with unlimited fuel. They die in their first 3 sorties, sometimes their first. The mathematics were brutal. 1942, Luftwaffe pilot, 240 training hours, 50+. Combat missions, average survival, high tactical proficiency. 1944, Luftwaffe pilot, 40 training hours, 3 to 7 combat missions, average survival, minimal tactical knowledge. The veteran corps, the experten who'd survived Poland, France, Britain, Russia, were being killed faster than undertrained replacements could absorb lessons. And every fuel plant the Mustangs escorted bombers to made the problem worse, the idle aircraft problem. By summer 1944, German factories were still producing fighters. Bf-109s and FW-190s rolled off assembly lines by the hundreds. But they sat on airfields, unfueled. Pilots sat in ready rooms, grounded. Not because aircraft were unavailable. Not because pilots didn't exist. Because there was no fuel to put them in the air. The Luftwaffe was drowning in fighters it couldn't fly, and pilots it couldn't train, while American bombers, escorted by Mustangs with fuel to burn, turned Germany's industrial infrastructure into rubble. General Major Galland summarized the spiral in a May 1944 staff meeting. We are trapped in a death spiral. Mustangs escort bombers to our fuel plants. Fuel production drops. Training suffers. New pilots die quickly. Experienced pilots are lost irreplaceably. Our formations weaken. More bombers get through. More fuel plants are destroyed. The cycle accelerates, and we cannot break it, because we cannot stop the Mustangs. The spiral had begun on March 6, 1944. By summer, it was unstoppable. The Luftwaffe's greatest asset wasn't its aircraft. It was the men who flew them, and the P-51s were killing them systematically. Veteran Corps. By 1944, Germany's elite fighter pilots, the Experten, represented an irreplaceable resource. These weren't ordinary aviators. They were men who'd flown combat since 1939, survivors of Poland, the Battle of Britain, the Eastern Front, pilots with 50, 100, 150+ kills, men who knew every trick, every tactic, every margin between life and death. Major Gunther Rall, 275 kills, Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords. Hauptmann Heinz Beer, 220 kills, veteran of every front. Oberleutnant Walter Dahl, 128 kills, tactical innovator. These men were the Luftwaffe's institutional memory, squadron leaders who kept formations alive through experience and judgment. Remove them, and the entire system collapsed. The Mustangs removed them. Targeted killing. American fighter tactics evolved quickly once P-51s reached German airspace. Early missions focused on protecting bombers. But experienced American squadron leaders recognized an opportunity. German formations depended on their veteran leaders. Kill the leader, and the formation fell apart. Colonel Hub Zemke, commanding the 56th Fighter Group, was explicit in his briefings. Watch for the aircraft leading the German formation. He's the veteran. He's the threat. Kill him first. The others will scatter. It worked. Experienced German pilots flew distinctively, smoother, more aggressive, better positioned. They stood out. And Mustang pilots, often veterans themselves with 200-plus combat hours, learned to recognize and target them. Hauptmann Rahl was shot down twice in 1944, survived both times, but spent months recovering. Major Baer was wounded 3 times. Oberleutnant Dahl watched his squadron commanders die one by one. Flying in skies. They no longer owned, for men who dominated European skies since 1939, the psychological shift was devastating. Lieutenant Heinz Knoke wrote in August 1944, "We used to hunt. Now we are hunted. Every mission, we climb knowing the Americans are above us, waiting, watching, choosing when to strike. We used to dictate the terms of combat. Now we fight only when they permit it. I've flown 400 missions. I've survived the Battle of Britain, Russia, the Reich defense. And now I feel like a student again, outmatched, outgunned, waiting to make the mistake that kills me." The arithmetic of attrition. The numbers were merciless. Luftwaffe Experten, pilots with 40-plus kills. In January 1944, 250. Luftwaffe Experten in January 1945. 280. Germany couldn't replace them. Training a pilot to competence took 18 to 24 months under ideal conditions. Training an Experten-level aviator took years of combat survival, something the collapsing Luftwaffe could no longer provide. Every veteran lost was a wound that wouldn't heal, and the Mustangs kept cutting. General Major Galland, himself a 104-kill ace, reflected after the war. "We lost great pilots, men of extraordinary skill and courage, not in equal combat, but in a war of attrition we couldn't win. They fought brilliantly against impossible odds, and they died, one by one, defending a sky that no longer belonged to us." When conventional tactics failed, the Luftwaffe turned to desperation. The innovations were brilliant. The results were futile. The Sturmgruppen, armor and suicide. By summer 1944, German bomber-destroyers faced an impossible problem: how to penetrate Mustang escorts and reach the B-17s. The answer was Sturmböcke, storm rams, P-51 stripped of unnecessary equipment and loaded with additional armor plating. Cockpit canopies reinforced with 2-inch bulletproof glass. Frontal armor thick enough to stop 50-caliber rounds. Weight, over 10,000 pounds, fully loaded. The tactic was simple and terrifying. Mass formations of armored FW-190s would charge straight into bomber formations, close to point-blank range, absorb defensive fire, and destroy B-17s with concentrated 30mm cannon fire. It worked. Sometimes. On July 7, 1944, Sturmgruppe formations destroyed 28 B-17s in a single attack. But the cost was devastating. The heavily armored FW-190s were slow, unmaneuverable, and helpless against Mustang escorts. American pilots learned quickly. Ignore the Sturmgruppen during their attack run. They were committed, couldn't maneuver. Wait until after they attacked the bombers, when they were slow, low on ammunition, and trying to escape. Then kill them. By September, Sturmgruppe units were suffering 60% plus casualty rates per mission. Veteran pilots, men who'd survived years of combat, were being massacred in aircraft that flew like armored trucks. The tactic was abandoned by October. Too many pilots dead, too few results. The Me-262, speed without fuel, the Messerschmitt. Me-162 was a miracle of engineering. The world's first operational jet fighter. Top speed, 540 mph, 100 plus, faster than any Allied piston fighter. Armament, 4 30mm cannons that could shred a B-17 in a single pass. On paper, it was a war winner. In reality, it was too little, too late, and fatally vulnerable. The problems: production. Germany managed to build $1,400 Me-262s. The Allies were producing 3,000-plus fighters per month. Fuel. Jet engines consumed fuel voraciously. By late 1944, there wasn't enough aviation fuel to operate jet units at scale. Vulnerability. Jets were fast in level flight but bled speed in turns. And they were completely helpless during takeoff and landing. Engines spooling up slowly, acceleration gradual. Allied pilots learned to ignore jets in flight and instead loiter near known Me-262 bases, waiting for them to land. Major George Preddy, commanding the 328th Fighter Squadron, described the tactic. We'd orbit 5 miles from their airfield at 15,000 feet. Wait for the 262s to return from missions, low on fuel, engines winding down for landing, dive on them in the landing pattern. They couldn't run, couldn't fight, couldn't escape. We shot them down like ducks on a pond. Dozens of Me-262s, irreplaceable aircraft flown by Germany's best remaining pilots, were destroyed on approach, wheels down, engines dying. The mathematics of futility. Germany's innovations couldn't overcome simple arithmetic. Sturmgruppen, brilliant tactics, inadequate numbers, slaughtered by escorts. Me-262s, superior technology, crippling fuel shortages, vulnerable deployment. Both failed for the same reason the entire Luftwaffe was failing. You cannot win an industrial war with tactical genius alone. The Americans had fuel, numbers, and P-51s waiting at every airfield. Germany had desperation. By January 1945, the Luftwaffe existed primarily on organizational charts. The squadrons had names, designations, commanding officers. What they didn't have were aircraft, fuel, or hope. The Paper Air Force JG-11, once a proud fighter wing with 120-plus aircraft, reported 14 operational fighters in February 1945. JG-26 had fuel for approximately 30 minutes of flight time per week, total, across the entire grouper. JG-3 hadn't flown a mission in 3 weeks, not because pilots were unavailable, not because aircraft were grounded for maintenance, because there was no fuel to put them in the air. Squadrons existed on paper. In reality, they were collections of grounded pilots sitting in empty ready rooms, waiting for fuel allocations that never came. Refusal. The breaking point came quietly, without drama or courts-martial. Pilots simply stopped volunteering for suicide missions. When orders came down for intercept missions against bomber streams escorted by 500-plus Mustangs, squadron commanders faced men who'd flown 200, 300, 400 combat missions, veterans who'd survived years of war, and saw them shake their heads. No fuel for combat maneuvering, no backup if we're hit, no rescue if we go down. What's the point? Commanders couldn't answer, because there was no point. Hauptmann Heinz Knock, grounded for lack of fuel, wrote in March 1945, "We sit and wait for fuel that won't come, for replacement pilots who can't be trained, for a miracle that won't happen." The younger pilots still believe the propaganda, secret weapons, miracle jets, final victory. The veterans know better. We've known since March 1944, when the Mustangs appeared over Berlin. We just couldn't say it aloud. The war in the air is finished. We're just waiting for permission to admit it. And the final missions. When fuel occasionally became available, missions were flown by the desperate or the deluded. Green pilots with 20 hours of training, convinced they could change the war. Fanatical volunteers who believed dying for the Reich was better than living in defeat. They flew into skies owned by Allied fighters and died predictably, quickly, uselessly. The veterans watched from the ground, grounded by fuel shortages, relieved to be grounded. And the admission. On April 12, 1945, General Major Galland, relieved of command, flying with JV-44, a jet unit operating on fumes, landed after a mission and told his pilots, "Gentlemen, we are finished, not because we lack courage, not because we lack skill, but because we are fighting an enemy who can put 1,000 fighters in the air while we struggle to fuel 50. This is not war anymore, it's arithmetic. And the arithmetic has spoken." No one argued. By late April, Luftwaffe units were surrendering en masse, not to the Soviets, but to the Western Allies, hoping for decent treatment and a quick end. The fighter pilots who'd once dominated Europe's skies sat in POW camps, exhausted, and felt nothing but relief that it was over. The war in the air hadn't ended with a climactic battle. It had ended with empty fuel tanks and the quiet acceptance that March 6, 1944, had been the beginning of the end. Raftangmere, England, September 1945. The war had been over for 4 months when former enemies met in an officers' club, drinks in hand, speaking carefully around wounds still fresh. General Major Adolf Galland, recently released from Allied custody, sat across from Colonel Hub Zemke, who'd spent the final year of the war in a German POW camp after being shot down. The conversation eventually turned to March 6, 1944, the German perspective. Galland lit a cigarette, exhaled slowly. "We knew it was over the moment your Mustangs appeared over Berlin. Not intellectually, we kept fighting for another year. But in our hearts, we knew. When single-engine fighters could escort bombers to the Reich's capital and return home with fuel to spare, the defensive strategy we'd built our entire Air Force around became irrelevant overnight." He paused, choosing words carefully. It wasn't just that you could reach Berlin. It was what that meant. No safe airspace, no sanctuary. Nowhere to regroup, retrain, rebuild, without your fighters circling overhead. You didn't just defeat us tactically. You erased the fundamental assumption that distance provides protection. After March the 6th, distance meant nothing. Hauptmann Heinz Knoke, sitting nearby, added quietly, "The psychological break was worse than the tactical one. We'd been told, by engineers, by leadership, by mathematics, that what you did was impossible. When it happened anyway, we lost faith. Not just in the range tables, in everything. If command was wrong about something so fundamental, what else were they wrong about?" The American perspective. Colonel Don Blakesley, who'd led the 4th Fighter Group's Mustangs deep into Germany, leaned forward. Before the P-51, daylight bombing was barely sustainable. Schweinfurt, Regensburg, we were losing bombers faster than we could replace them. Crews were flying 5, 6 missions and not coming back. The entire strategic bombing campaign was on the edge of collapse. He gestured with his glass. The Mustang didn't just escort bombers, it transformed the air war. Suddenly, we could go anywhere. Berlin, Munich, Ploiești. Fight for 30 minutes over the target. Come home. The bomber crews knew we'd be there. The Luftwaffe knew we'd be there. That certainty changed everything. Major Tom Hayes, who'd led the 357th Fighter Group on that first mission to Berlin, added, It wasn't just about protecting bombers. Once we had the range, we hunted. We went after their fighters, their airfields, their fuel infrastructure. The P-51 turned us from bodyguards into predators. That's what broke them. Not just that we could reach Berlin, but that we could stay there. The legacy. As the evening wore on and the conversation shifted to other topics, one truth hung unspoken in the air. March 6, 1944, hadn't just marked a tactical shift. It had defined the future of air power. Reach anywhere. Fight anywhere. Leave no sanctuary. Every air force that followed, Korean War, Vietnam, Desert Storm, beyond, would operate on the principle the P-51 proved over Berlin. Control of the air means the ability to project power anywhere, anytime, without limitation. Distance no longer provided protection. Sanctuary no longer existed. The sky belonged to whoever could reach it, and stay there long enough to fight. Kelland raised his glass in a final toast, his expression weary but without bitterness. To the P-51, the aircraft that taught us the war was lost and taught the world what air supremacy truly means. The Americans raised their glasses, and in that moment, former enemies shared a sober understanding. March 6, 1944, was the day the sky changed hands, and it never changed back.